Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Module 5 of our course. We're zipping right along, and today we're getting into a topic that I think is increasingly important as we get closer to Election Day in this particular semester, but is perennially important from the perspective of political scientists, and that is, of course, voting and voter turnout. So today I want to think a little bit about some of the different approaches the literature has taken to this subject. And I also want to apologize if you hear any weird snoring or, sighing or whatever underneath the desk. My dog is like right here, and so he tends to make himself heard a little bit. I'm not sure why he decided to come down here with me today. Usually he stays upstairs while I'm recording, but he decided to be here, so maybe he'll make his presence known. Anyway, getting into these different explanations for voter turnout, I think the foundational literature, and one of the reasons why I assigned this Verba Brady Schlossman book chapter is that it kind of gets into some of that, or what are known as resource-based explanations. And I have here on the slide that this kind of literature is what we might call a classic example of over-prediction. I know that doesn't mean much to you who maybe haven't taken a lot of stats classes before in your time in college, but what this really means translated is that a lot of this literature from the 70s to the 90s to even today some basically show that there's this kind of overarching pattern where like a lot of different things predict turnout, and they all predict turnout kind of together in a single bunch. They all move in the same direction. They all have some statistical significance. There's this association between all these different concepts and voter turnout it's like a really robust relationship. And so we can see that like age is highly correlated with voter turnout. Surprise, surprise, right? Like the older you get, the more likely you are to turn out. Income, the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to regularly vote in elections. Formal education, if you've got more years of education relative to fewer, then you're more likely to vote, right? If you have political knowledge, you're more likely to vote. So if we ask you to name, which party controls the House of Representatives and can you name like 3 Supreme Court justices or something? If you get those right, then surely you're going to vote more. And so altogether, I think the combination of all of these different predictors kind of all bundle together in what we might call the SES explanation, which is the idea that all these things run together, right? If you think about it, if you're really careful in thinking about this relationship, are age and income correlated? I mean, not perfectly, right? There are some young, wealthy people. I mean, how old is Mark Zuckerberg now? I guess he's getting older, right? Elon Musk can't be that old, right? We don't have a pure linear relationship between age and income, but in the aggregate, on average, yes, absolutely, the baby boomer generation has way more wealth than does the millennial or the Gen Z generation, partially because they've been in the workforce longer, but also just because that's kind of the way that wealth distributions work in societies. Is age correlated with formal education? Well, almost by default, right? If you're younger, you almost by default have less formal education because you haven't lived enough time to be able to accumulate it, right? Is income and formal education linked? Yeah, certainly. Those are correlated as well, right? You'd think that as you gain in formal education, up to, but perhaps not including a PhD, right? You get some sort of terminal, business degree or a, MD or something, you're going to get a lot more money than if you finish, with an 8th grade education. Those things are certainly correlated. Now, is age correlated with education, age, income, age, political knowledge? Absolutely, right? As you get older, you start to take more of an interest in politics for various reasons, right? Political knowledge. Now, certainly political knowledge doesn't predict age, although it may feel a little bit like you're 1,000 years old if you start paying attention to politics for any amount of time. But all of these things are wrapped up together in this kind of single bundle. If you think about these ideal types, like an ideal typical person, who's 68 years old, high income, has a lot of formal education, and knows a lot about politics. That's your constant, they don't miss a single election. You might also think about somebody who's really young, say they're 19, they have very low income because they're still, in school, still working things out. They don't have a BA yet, they're still working on it. And they have very little political knowledge because they haven't been exposed to that system much yet, right? And so that person is going to be a very intermittent voter, right? And of course, there's all kinds of other pieces of this explanation that we can talk about, and certainly we will in our discussion. But this is kind of the big chunk of where voting behavior scholars looked first for this stuff. And essentially, again, yeah, all this stuff is overpredicted. It's all kind of showing you there's a difference between two kind of types of people. Wealthy, highly educated people vote, and people who fall on the lower end of all those spectrums don't. But again, we don't really have a story here, right? Like think about all these stories that we just like told about this like this person, this ideal type person, right? This person, I guess the question is why are they voting so much? Like why does higher income make you more likely to vote? I mean, think about that for a second, right? Really, like really, you can even pause the slide and just think about that. Why would income alone have this effect? I mean, I suppose we could think about the idea that a high income means that you have like more, skin in the game per se, right? You've got a more vested interest in making sure that politicians that you like win, whereas if you don't, then maybe you don't care as much or something, which on the face of it, like that kind of explanation to me, it sounds ludicrous. Like it doesn't make any sense, right? Some of these things are simply just like demographic patterns in the electorate. But I think at the end of the day, what they fall into, fall into in terms of like the most plausible explanations for why we have this SES stratification, one is access. Okay, so again, like going back to that possibility that higher income people just have more motivation to vote or something, that doesn't make any sense to me, really. The access story makes a lot more sense, right? Where if you're working two jobs and neither of your bosses will let you take work off on election day, and you stand to lose your job on that day on the spot, that might be a much stronger deterrent to you being able to vote during voting hours than if you were somebody who worked like a cushy white collar job and they said, okay, yes, of course, we have a norm in our office that everybody goes to vote, right? So our income, which is of course determined by much else in our social milieu, right, could also be determinative. That's maybe like this access argument in general. Think about age too, right? College students, in many cases are having a really hard time to vote. Many college students are asking me whether they can vote, based on their dorm addresses at UMBC, they can get registered there, whether they have to vote, go back to wherever they came from to vote. They can, do absentee. Obviously this year is a little different, but one of the perennial questions college students always have is like, where do I vote, right? I mean, that is a huge thing. If you're more established in a community, say you've lived in a neighborhood for a decade, of course you know where your polling place is. You've walked by there 100 times. Whereas if you're living in an apartment and you've been in this area for 2 months, it might not be apparent to you, and you may need to re-register or change your address, your voting address. All these things, right? I think fall into this access camp. The other one, which we were hinting at, is this idea of social motivation. The idea that people who are at this higher end of the SES spectrum, part of this is that they are feeling a lot of pressure to vote for whatever reason. And now again, I don't think that it makes sense that people who are on the lower end of the SES spectrum aren't feeling an intrinsic motivation to vote for candidates. It may be that this is a slightly different process. And in just a moment, I'll talk about the possibility that individuals that are living at a high SES level are probably, it's more about your peers, right? And it's about your peers' social pressure or peer pressure more so than it is intrinsic pressure, an intrinsic belief that your vote matters or something. I think that's going to be a big difference in these explanations. But contrasting the access and the social motivation kind of stories, we have Verba, Brady, and Schlossman, the VBS. And really, they take what I think is a very different approach here, where they argue that SES is all about sort of granting you the ability to acquire the skills necessary to engage in all different forms of political participation. So not just voting, but writing letters to your representatives, calling members of Congress, doing some of like the higher order kinds of political behaviors. And so their argument essentially is that, again, if you have high SES, then you've probably been put in scenarios in your life where you've obtained these skills. You've learned them because it's a matter of course in the kinds of things that you do on a daily basis as a high SES person. Whereas as a low SES person, you might not have occasion most of the time to need those skills for anything other than the world of politics, and so you don't train in them, you don't practice them. So basically, you get these skill points, I guess, right? These sort of experience points that come from other kinds of activities in your life. And when you do those things enough, then they can map onto the world of politics. And so I guess my central question to you all, and one thing that I'm sure we'll talk about in our discussion, is whether you buy this, whether this makes sense to you, that these kind of skills can be gained elsewhere and then mapped to the world of politics. So here's a very stretched little screen grab of one of VBS's famous graphics. You can see they've got this like scale that they've constructed of like civic skills practiced. And so like at the highest level, it means you're practicing all kinds of civic skills, like you're learning how to like express yourself politically, write letters, do the stuff that you need to be able to do this higher order set of voter, voting and political behaviors. And you can see here that like they've found through surveys that on the job, right, among workers, right, if your family income is very high, you're going to have workplaces where civic skills are like a piece of the pie, right? So you're constantly having to express yourself in writing. You're constantly having to like argue your case, like in front of a group of people. You're constantly having to like, stake a claim. You're having to analyze evidence, like doing all the critical thinking stuff that, for example, maybe college also provides, right? Race or ethnicity, they're saying that there's among workers in terms of where these people work, essentially. This is really kind of an old school thing, right? Anglo whites here, whatever that means, right, have like on average 2.13 kind of like civic skill level in terms of their jobs vis-a-vis these other groups, because of course there might be differences in terms of the median member of each group and which kinds of jobs that they hold at that time. Keep in mind this is in like the early 90s. And then men, interestingly, I guess partially because of the fact that women and men in the 90s were holding quite different employment sectors generally, men are being exposed to jobs where they're getting more civic skill exposure on an average basis. Interestingly, though, there's a couple of other places besides the job where you can get some civic skills. And one is non-political organizations. So basically these civil society organizations like scouting, like, I think of like any number of things, bowling leagues, right? Anyone who's read any Robert Putnam stuff, like the famous book Bowling Alone, might think about this idea that you gain these civic skills in these non-political organizations. But again, right, I guess going to the country club, you have to, do these civic skills things more often than if you're going to the bowling league or something. So would argue this graphic. Similarly, your non-political organizations, you're using more civic skills slightly if you're a man, or, again, a number of different breakdowns here. But then importantly, there's also churches, and especially would argue Verba, Brady, and Schlossman, like Protestant churches are going to be important in helping to foster these civic skills. And interestingly, it's not as stratified here, right? So it's like, across the board, maybe Latinos have a slightly lower density of civic skills gained in church, but African Americans actually are sort of the leading category here among race and ethnicity in terms of church-based civic skills and stuff. So the idea being that a lot of the time you're getting your skills, the skills that map onto your ability to figure out politics from your job, and whatever job you're holding. If you've got this high income job, you're doing this stuff on a daily, weekly, monthly basis that makes you think about and learn about and be able to harness the power of politics. But of course, that's not the only place where you can get that. And especially in church, they would argue, is another place. Which really, if you think back to like older kinds of explanations, like I think this resonates really strongly with some of the observations of like the civil rights movement, for example, saying that like the Black church was instrumental in helping to like organize and mobilize, large groups of individuals. And what they're essentially saying here is that part of that story still holds up, at least in the 1990s. And again, here we see again, they've got these, I don't need to belabor this point, but the idea again being that church skills and job skills, right? Blacks in both high status and low status jobs are able to use church skills, right? Like 50% of them are getting, 45% are getting the ability to, do some kind of political presentation or to plan some kind of political meeting, right? The kinds of skills that they would argue matter for becoming more politically active in your life. However, this sort of like equivalency doesn't endure among whites. You can see that the church skills is much lower for the low status whites versus the high status whites. So again, it's a very interesting kind of thing, taking on this idea that civil society organizations, including but not limited to churches, also teach civic skills. So it's an interesting piece. I really want, with all of these pieces, I really want to use these as springboards to get our gears turning, right? Because I think that the turnout explanation, there's no single explanation. And this is one book that a lot of people have read, a lot of people have had thoughts about, and I really want to know yours as well. Maybe you disagree fundamentally with this observation. Maybe you've got a different theory as to why these patterns play out in their data. I'd love to see what you think. But I also want to introduce, or at least briefly discuss in this video, the Frage paper that we had to read for this week. I want to just talk very briefly. The Frage paper is really cool, specifically because of the fact that it's probably the cutting edge of a technology that we have where we're able to figure out whether or not people are pretending to have voted in surveys. And so by that I mean we're able to determine validated turnout data from all these people who are providing their political participation in the data that Frage is analyzing. And we are able to do that because this company, which you may have seen referenced, is called Catalyst. Essentially, they are able to verify, they check all the individuals in these samples against county-level voter records, and they're able to figure out if people are not registered who said that they were voters, and also if they turned out in specific elections. So they match the names, and they're able to match the names with a really, really high accuracy, not perfect accuracy, of course, because you've got two different databases, and anytime you try to make these comparisons without some kind of identification beyond names, there's going to be a little bit of miss there, right? But they get really close, like 97, 98, 99% close at determining which people on surveys said that they voted but in fact didn't. And so this is a really, really high quality way to determine real actual voter turnout patterns nationwide. And so Frage is coming at this with a slightly different approach than is like VBS, where he's saying it's not just about civic skills, not just about SES, it's not just about any of these access issues. It's also about co-ethnicity. And so there's a long-standing literature out there that basically says, hey, it's a good idea to have co-ethnics on the ballot because if you've got a co-ethnic candidate, that's going to boost voter turnout. The most prominent example of that we could possibly think of was like, oh, black turnout is higher if Obama's on the ballot, basically, because black people want to come out and support a candidate that has their shared characteristic or whatever. However, at the level of Congress, that linkage has been debated, right? And it's not clear that the data bear out this one-to-one relationship, which matters a lot if we think about things like, communities lobbying for minority or majority-minority districts, for example. They might say, hey, we're okay with certain forms of gerrymandering because, even though we're basically being packed into a single district where we end up with a majority-minority district in, for example, the South, that's okay. We're not going to protest that case too much. Don't do cracking, right? Don't disperse our political power across a bunch of districts so that we never get a candidate we like. But if this district becomes majority minority by way of gerrymanders, it's not the worst thing in the world because we're going to feel like we have better descriptive representation. And so the research question here is, does that kind of thing boost minority turnout, having this co-ethnic candidate? And Frage actually finds something really counterintuitive, which is actually that it's not that. It's actually not that co-ethnic candidate that's doing the turnout boost in a lot of these places. What's really happening here, and what Frage is kind of revealing, is that it's actually something that maybe even is like VBS, like the VBS story, but maybe a much more compelling version of it. Where in this case, the turnout is actually influenced more by having a strong community of co-ethnic voters in the district. So it doesn't matter if there's a co-ethnic candidate that's on the ballot. Even in cases where there's not that co-ethnic candidate, if you've got this strong community of like-minded co-ethnic voters, that's where turnout starts to go up for minorities, basically. And so this is really giant on the screen here, but it says, in contrast to the prevailing interpretation of empowerment-based theories of minority political participation, which would again argue that it's really about having minority candidates, I find limited effects of minority candidates on co-ethnic turnout. While turnout is sometimes higher when a co-ethnic's on the ballot, across all groups, we cannot say it's higher on average after accounting for the share of the population an ethnic group comprises within the district. Instead, the relative size of a voter's ethnic group is associated with increased participation in general elections even without a co-ethnic on the ballot. So again, this key idea here in Frage's work is that it's actually sort of about the community and the demographics of the district itself. And so in a place where you've got political power that's fomenting in a community where there's suddenly more and more people of an ethnic group, that's where you're going to start to see that community take off in terms of its political participation. And my kind of hunch here, and I think something that Fraga sort of relates as well, is that this brings us to turnout research that's happening today, where really I think a lot of the emphasis is on the psychological dimension. And so from the VBS kind of story of civic skills, we actually now have an evolution into other explanations of how we feel when we go to vote. And so there's a lot of research out there that shows that if we remind voters that it's their civic duty to vote, that activates a lot of people. They think about voting, they say, "Oh yes, it's my civic duty." Even though I might not benefit directly from this at the individual level, I'm very unlikely to be the single voter that tips the election. Going to perform this task as like my civic duty is something that makes me feel good, essentially. And so as a result, because we know that voting makes people feel good, we also know that we can find ways to make them feel bad if they don't do it. And so a lot of experimental work these days is looking at ways to increase essentially peer pressure and social shame for not participating. And a famous set of experiments by Donald Green and a couple other people essentially put out mailers to people and said, "Hey, voting, it is not public record to find out who you voted for, but it is public record to find out whether or not you voted. We're able to see your voting history, and of course that is true. You can find out if you go into county records or whatever whether somebody turned out in whichever election." We can find out if you voted or not, says this mailer, and consequently, we will tell your friends and neighbors. We'll put up a board of all the non-voters on this block, and we'll send a mailer listing the non-voters if you don't vote this time. And lo and behold, right, wherever they sent those mailers, turnout skyrocketed. It's like 100%. And so, that experiment is kind of a cheeky way to see that this thing happens in action. But again, I think this actually connects really well to some of the results that Fraga is finding here, which is that, in these places where those communities start to grow and develop, and you start to have, a larger base, essentially, of co-ethnics who are able to spend time with each other and able to, feel a sense of community empowerment, that's where we see turnout take off, partially because you're not so atomized. You have a community where you're feeling like we have a common political goal. And so you start to see people, again, applying that peer pressure and applying that social dimension of like, hey, we all need to go out and vote. We have the ability to change outcomes. Let's go do it. Whereas in a situation where maybe co-ethnics are very, very few, very far between, you don't have that sense of community as much, and you're not going to be able to get out there and have that sense of shared sort of peer pressure towards the voting task. So, I even think, co-ethnicity is one way that we could slice this, but I also think about like college students, right? I know many of you are getting inundated right now with like get out the vote kind of communications. And, it's no wonder maybe that a lot of people start to develop those lifelong sort of turnout behaviors in college when they start to get exposed to this stuff, where you're around a large group of like-minded, individuals who care very much about political issues and are pressuring you to participate. This might be one of the reasons why there's an enduring gap, essentially, between college-educated people voting more than non-college-educated people. Again, maybe this kind of social pressure is both a mechanism driving some of Fraga's results and also some of these other foundational SES-based explanations. So with that having been said, I am really excited to hear some of your thoughts on this literature, to talk a little bit about your views on these kind of conflicting models of turnout. And I, again, also really am looking forward to reading your initial impressions of the 2020 election on the basis of your forecasting models. So have a wonderful week, and I very much look forward to our discussion on Wednesday.